Hey guys, how you doing? So welcome to the fifth and the final part in chapter 4. Now this kind of part takes a bit of a twist, and then rather than looking at animals, we're going now to look at organ systems in plants. Yeah, in particular, the organ system responsible for transport in plants. We're going to jump into it. We're going to take a look at a particular segment of plants called vascular plants. Now, plants are divided into many different categories, but one of the kind of major evolutionary transformations that you sort of see in the plant kind of world is this development of what we call a vascular plant, which is a form of a higher plants. Now, they are the trees, they are your pines, they are your major plants that you sort of see all around the world, forming your great rainforest to your temperate rainforest to all of the environments, the trees and shrubs that you see, because a vascular plant is not just a kind of like any of your ground dwelling plants, but it is a plant that have transport vessels that allows them to transfer materials from one part of the plant towards another part of the plants. Now this includes all of your flowering plants, your pines and your ferns and things like that. Basically all of the big stuff that you see now are considered as vascular plants because they have this system that allows them to move materials from one part to another. Yeah, it's what allows plants to become so successful and being one of the most abundant in the world today. In fact, in terms of organic matter, the vascular plants take up the largest amount of any category of organisms, plant or animals, with the exception of maybe bacteria. I think bacteria probably match that amount pretty well. Yeah, the kind of evolution of plants has allowed them to develop two major transport vessels, which has changed the kind of gameplay for plants all around the world in all the history of time. Okay, and so we're going to take a look at these systems and how they work, and we're going to examine them closely. Yeah, they both form part of the center of the plant, which is forming your vascular bundle, but they are two different types of transport vessels. There's one called the xylem, which is your woody or otherwise known as lignified tissue. And your xylem is responsible for transport of water and minerals from your roots to your leaves. Yeah, that is what gets the water from the roots to the leaves where they're necessary. And the thing about xylem vessels is that they're actually dead. They're dead and they're hollow tubes, which then become a form of drawing water out from the roots to the leaves. Yeah, and the second category of vessels is what we call the phloem vessels. Yeah, the phloem vessels, unlike the xylem, are now living tissue, which transports organic compounds such as your sugars from your leaves to other parts of the plants, and they, as we said, they are living. Here is the structure of a cross section of a leaf on a plant. Yeah, if I took the plant and I cut it along this way, and then I looked into it, I would see this kind of layout. Now, this is the general structure of a typical leaf. Not all leaves have this structure, but based on this structure, we can understand the majority of structures found within your leaves. Okay, you can see each of these things there are being cell, etc., etc. Even a cell there, and there. And what happens is the leaf has the top layer of what we call the cuticle. Yeah, the cuticle is a waxy layer that forms over leaves, and it's what gives them that kind of waxy texture that when you feel when you grab a leaf, right? And what that does, that actually prevents water from getting through the front or the top of the leaf. Yeah, it's waterproof, and so no water will pass through the cuticle, we'll explore why that is in a second. And then you've got your epidermis. The epidermal layer is the surface layer of the leaf, and below the epidermis of the leaf is what we call the mesophyll. The mesophyll is the layer of cells which is responsible for photosynthesis. Now you'll notice that the majority of mesophylls are stacked vertically because they're packed with chloroplasts, and that allows them to photosynthesize. So there you've got your, went too far, your palisade mesophyll, which forms your kind of major photosynthetic region of your leaf. And then you've also got your spongy mesophyll, which is what gives the plant its kind of loft and volume. It also allows it to grab air from the outside environment and store air within the leaf itself. And so it's spongy because it has all these air pockets in between. And then at the bottom of the cell, you've got your lower epidermal layer there, which is lidded by what we call the stoma or the stomata. Yeah, the stoma means the whole, and the stomata is the whole structure. Yeah, the stomata is what allows the plant to take in the gases that it needs, in particular carbon dioxide, then it also allows it to release oxygen and also allows it to release excess water molecules that it has. Okay, now the part that we're interested is this middle part here, which is your vascular bundle. And the vascular bundle, you can see they're surrounded by two segments. Yeah, the purple is the xylem tubes, and then the blue is the phloem tube surrounded by another dermal layer. Yeah. Now, three distinct parts. We've already talked about this in chapter 3, but I'll just overview it again. You've got your roots, which is what draws water and minerals up the cell and provides structural support for the cell. You've got your stem, which forms the middle part, the trunk and things like that, which transports water up and it transports nutrients down and to other parts of the plant that requires the nutrients. For example, the roots, because they can't photosynthesize. And then finally, you've got your main photosynthetic organ, which is your leaf, which sits at the top forming the crown. And that is responsible for photosynthesis, sends the organic compounds that it produces to the other parts of the plant, and it draws water from the base of the plant up and out through the leaves, which is part of the photosynthesis process. Okay, and so there are kind of two major tissue groups in all plants. Yeah, not all plants kind of have the same kind of cells all over the place, but some tissue are involved in one area of kind of development in the plant, and the other one is involved in a different area, right? And so the first one is what we call the meristematic tissue, the part of the plant that grows. Yeah, it is responsible for growth in the plant, and the cells can undergo division and continue to divide for the life of the plant. They are the part of the plant that is continually growing, and what actually happens is the meristematic tissue then dies and becomes permanent tissue, cells that can no longer divide, and they're used for other purposes. Yeah, ground tissue is used for storage of plants like tubers and things like that. And then you've also got vascular tissue, which is what allows it to transport your xylem vessels and so forth. And then you've got your outer layer tissue, which is your dermal layer or dermal tissue called bark, which is the dead stuff that you see on the outside of the plant, right? So that's why the bark is often the dead part. But when you rip open the bark, you'll notice a bit of greenery because now you're reaching into the meristematic tissue below the bark, which is the growing part of the plant. You cut the tree right into the center, and you reach the vascular or the ground tissue of the plant. Which is then responsible for the transport and movement of it. And that's what the wood is. The wood is the permanent tissue, and then the leaves and the other parts of the plants that actually starts to grow and is green is the meristematic tissue. Okay, and all of that you can have a look at yourself. All right, let's take a look at the first component, which is the xylem vessels. These xylem vessels are responsible for water transport in your plants. They transport water and any dissolved minerals that is within the water up the plant. And one of the key questions that you kind of have to ask is why does water, where does the water need to go to, and why? And the reason for that is for photosynthesis, as we talked about in chapter 3, and is drawn through the roots, but moves up the plants through a process called transpiration. Transpiration is a remarkable process because it is entirely without the use of energy. A plant can draw water from the base of the roots to the top or the crown of the plant without having to exert any energy from its behalf, and the water naturally moves up there through 3 distinct processes, which I'll talk about in a second. Okay, the transpiration happens through these xylem tubes, and they're long and they're hollow and they're dead, which means that the plant cannot put energy into the system, but it still manages to do it, which is quite entirely through physics. And it also is what forms the woody part of the plant. When you cut down wood or the trunk of a tree, you're cutting through the xylem vessels. And that's what they look like there. These kind of hollow tubes that move up along the base of the plant in the center. Here's the diagram of what they look like under a microscope. This is a plant kind of cross-section of a stem, and you can still see all the cells there, and then you see these great big vascular bundles there, and then each of these vascular bundles are containing your xylem tubes, which is right there. Okay, and the xylem tubes kind of form these little kind of compartments in between, right, where they've got these tracheids and then these pits, and allows water to move up along your tube. And then what happens is they are also surrounded by a material called lignin. Now, lignin is made up of a kind of a material that is really tough, but is extremely kind of flexible, and it forms these coils, or these lignin coils, around your xylem vessels. And what it does, provides the structural support for the xylem vessels, because as you'll find later on, the pressure in this system demands that the structure of the vessels need to be quite strong and firm so that it doesn't collapse in on itself and it doesn't get bent or anything like that, which is also the reason why a lot of your plants are quite tough and strong as well. Okay. Okay, let's talk about transpiration. This diagram is incredibly useful to know because it kind of outlines the 3 major steps of transpiration and how that works. Okay, now the key thing about the roots, if we start off, is that they have a high solute concentration, which means water naturally moves from the soil into the roots by osmosis. Yeah, and so the water uptakes through the roots, and specifically through the root hairs that are sitting on the root cells, and then it finds and makes its way into your xylem vessel from the roots. Okay. The roots contain, we call this root pressure, and the pressure of the osmotic pressure pushes the water into the roots, and then what happens is when it reaches into your stem, it moves up by 2 particular processes. Yeah, the first one is adhesion. Adhesion is when water sticks to the side of a surface. Yeah, so in this particular case, it sticks to the side of the xylem vessels there, naturally through electrostatic forces there. And then, oops, sorry, I went too far. And then also cohesion, which is when water sticks to each other. And so as long as there's no air bubbles in your xylem vessels, the water will keep moving up. And it has this kind of pressure that draws the water up and pushes it upwards. And because the water is sticking to itself and to each other, it draws the water up continually. Now, because of this adhesion-cohesion process, the diameter of the xylem vessels cannot be too wide, because if it's too wide, the physical forces that drives it kind of falls apart. The water becomes too heavy and it can't draw enough. It's like, for example, when you have a small straw versus a big straw, you can draw water up more readily and hold the water at a higher level than with a big straw, because in a big straw, the water pressure drops, and then the weight of the water pushes it and pulls it back down again, and this adhesion-cohesion kind of balance fails. Now, so what plants do to compensate is they have small tubes, but they have hundreds and thousands of these small tubes within the trunk of the tree, depending on the diameter of the trunk, right? And then what happens is the tree then pulls the water up through the leaves by a process called transpiration pull. Transpiration pull is when water leaves the leaf, it draws more water up from below, creating this suction power that draws it up. And so you kind of have this, it's being sucked into the roots there, it is drawn up and is held in place by adhesion cohesion, and then it is sucked out of the leaves, drawing more water up in the process. So it's like a little conveyor belt drawing water through the whole time. And what happens is the plant then uses some of the water that is being drawn and released from the leaf. Yeah, it's released through the stomata or the stoma, and then out into the atmosphere. And so actually, for a plant to use water, it needs to actually lose and release some water in the process. Some of the water is used for photosynthesis, and the others are actually released through the plant. And so the plant has this kind of a bit of a dilemma. Yeah, it needs to constantly draw water up the plant, but in conditions that is dry and hot, it can't lose too much water, but it can't shut off that process completely. Otherwise, it will not get any water at all through the process. And even if you water a leaf, if it's not drawing water from the roots and up the plant, then actually that process kind of fails. Yeah, and so that's part of the challenges that plants have to face, and they need to balance the process of water release versus water absorption in that transpiration process. And so it's quite a remarkable process. This whole thing doesn't take any energy, and it also requires the plant to be within a certain height. And you can actually calculate it physically. These tubes physically means that the limit of the height of a plant sits at about 130 or so meters, because after 130 or so meters, plants can't actually draw any more water up, which is no significance to sort of know that the tallest tree in the world, the Californian redwood, I think, or the sequoia, sits at about 120 or so meters at max height, right? Because that's the maximum height that it can grow. Yeah. Plants also go through a bit of another struggle as well. For example, during the frost season, when in the northern hemisphere, when it's winter and it gets really cold, water freezes. So plants actually have to figure out a method of preventing the water inside of their own tissue from freezing, because if it does, what happens is, if that freezes there, then you actually don't get any more adhesion-cohesion processes, and that process of transpiration hits a stop and it doesn't work because the water is frozen. Frozen water sticks to the surface and it doesn't move, right? And so the plant has to try and overcome that by a few different processes, by releasing sugar into the water, and then it actually allows the sugar to act as a bit of an anti-frost. Okay. All right. Onto the phloem, nutrient transport. So the organic substances are being made up in the leaves, and then they need to move to other areas of the plant. that do not photosynthesize, and it needs to provide that energy. Now, this process is called translocation, which is different from transpiration, and translocation is the movement of organic material throughout a plant. And the phloem vessels are responsible for that process. They are living, and therefore the movement of organic material needs to be done through active transport, and that takes energy. And so they are made up of two components called sieve tubes, which is what the main bulk of the material moves across, and then the sieve tubes have these companion cells attached to them, which provides the energy for active transport to occur, right? And that's what they look like there. Okay, your sieve tubes are right there, these big hollow tubes there, which are made up of cells which have been hollowed out, and then the cells next to them are your companion cells, and allows it to move. Yeah, and so water and food can move freely both ways. Now, obviously, the water is not the same water that is used for transpiration. It's the water that's mainly used for moving the food or the nutrients along there. Okay, although mind you, they are very close to xylem tubes as well. Okay, here's a diagram of what it looks like. Same thing there, very similar in terms of their structure. Now, after the photosynthesis occurs in the leaf of the plant, the glucose alone is not what the leaf transports around the plant, right? It gets converted into a material called sucrose. Sucrose is like glucose, but just slightly altered, and then it enters into the sieve tubes. Yeah, these sieve tubes are hollowed out. There's no nucleus, and there's very few organelles, and they've contained these. It's meant to say pores. Sorry, guys. It contains these pores at the end, and then the companion cells are much smaller than your sieve tubes, but they provide the active transport energy required to move it along there. And they've got your nucleus and your mitochondria and all those other cells as well. Okay, and so the process of xylem and phloem are kind of interrelated. Yeah, the phloem requires water from the xylem in order to do that, and then it cycles water between them. Yeah, so your xylem transports water up through your xylem tubes for the purpose of photosynthesis, and then what happens is whatever is being produced from those photosynthesis and storage cells moves through the phloem tubes, and what happens is water can move back into the xylem if necessary, or back into the phloem depending on how much water the phloem needs to transport its materials. Okay. Alright, that's it for chapter 4. So I hope you guys enjoyed that, and I'll catch you guys next time.